Good afternoon. A bit of a stutter there from me because it's 5 o'clock on a Tuesday, and what has for quite over 100 episodes mostly been weekly is now a one-off until I get more inspiration. What Comes Next Live podcast. My guest this fine late winter March in the UK is. I'm coming from South London, and my guest is Johnnie Moore, who I believe is up in the Cambridge area. Johnny first came to my attention through a mutual friend in the overlapping circles, a gentleman called Alan Moore, who I worked with on a beautiful leadership project, which I think tangentially led to his latest book on building beautiful businesses, which is one of the Do books. Never met Johnny at that time, but Johnny was in the background of many conversations of people going, "You should meet Johnny, he's amazing." And broadly speaking, I went, that's interesting. And we have actually now overlapped, and not actually yet met in real life, but through various groups and group Zoom calls and such like. And I have participated in one or two of Johnny's abundantly offered, as in free, conversations. Unhurried Conversations is one of those, and I have a copy of Johnny's Unhurried Conversations book. I was going to save for the video audience on my bookshelf, but my office is currently bare because I'm in the process of moving house. It's in the box of books from that bookshelf right now. Anyway, big long introduction. Welcome, Johnny.
Hi, Tom. Good to see you. Nice to be here.
So, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're focused on right now, what's on your mind. Your big
if I have to give myself a label when people ask me what I do, I say I'm a facilitator. Mm-hmm. So I go to people's meetings and try to make them more engaging and satisfying for the participants, and often meaning less death by PowerPoint if possible. Mm-hmm. And that shades off into what you might call group coaching, and I've been involved in some leadership programs as well. But essentially, I like working with groups, and I like to work in a very improvisational way. I'm not a big fan of standard procedures and models. I'm more interested. I find groups come to life when something goes wrong. I like it when something goes wrong, because that's usually a sign of something interesting and real happening in the room, where the standard operating procedure has been disrupted, and then I think something interesting can happen.
Cool. So if we'd had a little dialogue on LinkedIn about facilitation, so we can maybe delve into that. And to begin with, you get brought in to work with groups, and you seek to make the meetings more engaging and satisfying for the participants. For the people, perhaps the principals of that organization, the people leading that organization, why do they call Johnny to come in?
I think one reason is that generally I'm getting called into meetings where there is something at stake. There's something important that needs to happen. Mm-hmm. And I think one reason for them to have someone from the outside facilitate is so that they don't have to. Mm-hmm. Because it then frees them up to speak more freely and to advocate strongly for what they want. Whereas if they were running the meeting, they'd be worried about looking neutral, and that could really cramp their style. So one of the benefits of having someone come in from the outside is it liberates them to take part as participants. So that's one reason. I think another is that they probably sense that meetings and organizations tend to default to being a little bit plodding, and when something is important is at stake, they think they need something hosted with a bit more skill to encourage a bit more energy and spontaneity. And an outsider can often do that more easily than an insider.
Mm-hmm. Those make a lot of sense. I mean, overall, the theme that something's at stake, it is useful if somebody comes in, because I do some of this work too. And so I'm basically agreeing with you, so that they don't have to, they can take a different position in the room. Also to not be death by PowerPoint or a plodding meeting, and bring the skill, bring the energy, bring the spontaneity. sometimes it's difficult to see ourselves, but what have people told you as to why you, not another facilitator? Because those are quite generic reasons why you would bring a facilitator in. What have people told you that why they brought you in, or maybe they've used somebody else before and they go, you know what, Johnny, let's use you this time.
I know what my mind wanders to. It's not a completely direct answer to your question, but I think it gets to the nub of it. Is the thing that I most like hearing as feedback is when someone says something like, and this is something that has happened to me a few times. It happened very specifically at quite a challenging gig I was doing in Eastern Europe. Someone sort of called me at the end and they said, it's very interesting watching you. What I like about the way you do this is you seem to know when to vanish into the background and almost disappear, and when to come into the foreground and assert yourself. And you seem to have a good instinct for when to do one and when to do the other. And I think of facilitation as much more art than science, and in a sense as a kind of a performance. I think people choose me because they sense that I'm going to be alive to what's going on, and I think that ability to judge quite well when to actually get out of the way and just let them get on with it. And sometimes that means leaving them struggling a bit rather than sort of giving them a band-aid. And knowing when to stop something that you can tell, immediately is not going to help the meeting along. I think it's that, I suppose you could call it aliveness or presence. I suppose that's what it is. It's much more of an intuitive felt thing than a list of competencies. Yeah. There's a lot happened in my brain just listening to you. I'm sorry about that.
That's very British, but it's the opposite of being sorry. It's like, I'm pleased to have spurred thought. Like, I'm very appreciative. I do this. If I reflect on myself and just throw it back to you, so anything useful comes out of my own reflections, it's normally what I say to people. If I get brought into the room, I've already been brought in because they've used somebody else and it didn't get the results they wanted the previous year or whatever, and I get introduced in through somebody, a referral of some kind. But if I get into the room, I'll normally say to both the principal of the group beforehand in planning it, and actually in the room, I'll say, so what's worked? What's worked before? What hasn't worked before? What do you want to see different? Right? But I'm normally brought in. It's like Kay had the thing. Kay Scorer, our friend on that LinkedIn thread, who also is a really well-renowned facilitator as you are, so she's rebranded herself as a difficilitator. So obviously she likes the difficult conversations. And my networking icebreaker is, if it says talk to me about, mine is elephants, right? Because there's always an elephant in the room. I do find that I seek the struggle. If there's anything like a process I have when they're looking to make a difficult decision, which is really what I call group coaching, because you're looking to have an outcome at the end, not defining what the outcome is, but some clarity, an outcome, a decision from which they can all be aligned around and move forwards and take action. It's not entertainment. It's not warm and fluffy. It normally means there's something knotty problem they have to work out. And there's the very simple process I use, which is a really high level overlay. Somewhere in the middle of the day, there's going to be a really uncomfortable conversation going on. And I do agree with you. Sometimes the bit I find I've often found most personally challenging is because I am somebody who likes to provide answers in some spaces of my life. But if you're standing at the room in front of sometimes 50 people and they're stuck and the energy in the room is really awkward, that all of their energy is focused on you at the front, but as if to say, please, Mr. Expert, can you bail us out? And that's one reason why I quite like having a second in the room, somebody else with me, who, again, can play a different role because they're not standing at the front of the room. They may co-facilitate parts of the day. And I normally turn around to them. People are thinking I'm asking them for absolute expert advice on what to say. Normally what I'm saying is, they're really uncomfortable, aren't they? And sometimes what I'll say is, I have absolutely no idea what to do next. At which point I normally smile, and they'll smile, and they'll go, well, you'll know when you turn around and look at them. And my favorite example was I broke the ice when their issue fundamentally was they weren't taking action on a really big issue in the organization. And I had just sat, this is 10 years ago, when my youngest was quite little. And I just sat with him on my lap a few days before and watched a Star Wars movie. I said, there was a little green man who said, do or do not, there is no try. At which point this broke the ice. And people started making quotes from Kung Fu Panda and Yoda and all kinds of stuff. And all these executives in Savile Row suits started to talk about what the problem was. But I'd never walked into that room thinking I'd be quoting Yoda. But I love it when it gets really uncomfortable, because it means something, it means they're engaged, and it means there's something that is going to happen. But I love what what I love what you said is knowing when to vanish into the background and when to assert yourself in the foreground. I've been doing this quite a while, not as long and as often as an expert like yourself. But I find I'm quite good at it, but I also always find it a fascinating moment when you're in the room and you sometimes have to relax and make the decision as to whether to vanish or whether to come forwards. So
yeah,
not sure if that storytelling got it spurred anything.
It's practice, and it's never completely comfortable, because you can never be sure. There's always going to be some little voice in one's head saying, oh, they're expecting you to do something here, that we were expecting you to do something, and then to sit there and not do something. And sometimes it's just to sit there and just tell myself to relax, and I might smile very gently and sort of try to convey that I'm not going to do something and wait. And I've had a lot of, because of this unhurried conversation thing I've been doing for 8 years, I've had a lot of practice at that, just not doing things and waiting. And it's nearly always rewarded with something quite interesting that comes from someone in the group that's better than anything I could have done. So that's the kind of the thing about, I was going to say passive, but that's not exactly the word, because I am very present when that's happening. I am paying attention. I've not sort of lit a cigarette and gone to buy a newspaper. I am very present, and I think there is something. I think there is something about them knowing that you are paying attention, and you are making a deliberate choice not to help them out. That I think they can sort of intuit, that they realize, oh, he's sort of leaving it to us, isn't he? And I think this stuff is all so subtle, isn't it? Because it would be so easy to sound like a smartass when you say, I'm not going to rescue you. I could imagine saying that in a way that would sound like, oh, I'm being cleverer than you, which is not, never going to be true with me. I'm never going to be cleverer than them. And then and I'm also thinking of the counterexamples where I'll break something up. If I think energy is completely sapping, I'll have a break or I'll change the activity. I think I do make a judgment of when something is a pregnant silence where something interesting could happen, and just an exhausted silence where we've been doing this for too long. We need to move. We need to do something different. We need to drop that, pause on that subject and have a look at it from another angle. And I guess as I'm talking to you, it's all very intuitive, I think, for me.
Where do you think that intuition comes from?
I suppose it's experience.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of gradually have to confess I've been doing this for quite a long time, and I'm getting on a bit. So I've been around the block a few times. So I suppose I've now sort of become familiar with many of the kind of patterns that you see in meetings. So I guess I'm less surprised by things now than I might have been when I was doing this work 10, 20 years ago. I don't get caught as often doing something really clumsy, because I think I've mostly seen it before. Mm-hmm. I think something that I've been paying more attention to is, I've had this phrase in my head for a few days now. It's not about the fish is the phrase, and I try and make a short story of it because it could be a very long story. But I was doing some work with someone who was practicing having a difficult conversation with someone who was eating the food that he'd prepared, but spat it out, spat the food out and said, "I hate this fish. I'd rather die than eat any more of it." And they got into a big conflict over it. And we were playing with how else you might have responded. And we tried lots of things. None of them were working. We tried the, "Oh, no, it's good for you," or "never mind, but let's go for a walk," or "but I put a lot of effort into it." None of them worked. And then out of the blue, he tried saying, "Oh, yeah, I hate fish too." Which was not true because he likes fish, but he decided to say to his brother, "Oh, I hate fish too." And I thought, oh, that's interesting. That's completely changed the game into something that I think, to me, felt like it completely bypassed the argument. And it occurred to me that it wasn't about the fish.
No.
And now that's my catchphrase I'm using a bit lately, because I think so often we think our arguments and conversations are about the thing that we appear to be talking about, but actually all sorts of other signaling is going on. A very crude example of it, from British politics this week is when Match of the Days was reduced to 20 minutes without commentary. When people said they preferred it, they weren't really saying they preferred it. They were saying, "I support the Tories and I don't like, and I don't like Gary Lineker." And people who said it was rubbish, they weren't saying it was rubbish. They were saying, "Oh no, I'm more left leaning and I'm against stopping the boats." We were just signaling our political loyalties while superficially talking about whether we like this particular television program or not. And it occurs to me, I think we're doing this a huge amount of the time. And I think I've got better at catching it. And so to sort of, I think it is quite helpful to have a sense of what people are overtly talking about is not the only thing that's going on. There's other things going on. There's other signaling happening that's worth paying a bit of attention to.
When I started, there's lots of identities and labels. When I started coaching, one of my mentors got on a call with me. He was really energized and he was sharing one of his experiences. And he said, "I just did some pure energy work with a group in group coaching." And he only spoke one language, which is English. And he'd had a colleague bring over a client of his from Germany, and they conducted the meeting in German. And the colleague, who spoke both languages, was translating. And it was slowing the meeting down an awful lot. Right, because the colleague was leading the meeting in German and then slowing down to translate the key bits for his position as his mentor, who was going to do it. And so what they actually said, "I tell you what, stop doing that. I don't need the content. I will tap my pen on the desk when there's something they're saying that I want you to translate. All right, and then just find a break and tell me that 10-second piece they were talking about." Right. So what was he doing? He was reading the energy behind the words. Couldn't listen to the words, the content. He could only listen to what was going on. And the thing that occurs to me in listening to you, and also I can't help but reflect on my own experience at the same time, is that bit about that intuition. Some of it is, I'm sure you've had enormous amounts of training and learning and instruction and all things on how to do facilitation with methods and standard operating procedures. And sometimes there is this concept of prepare thoroughly so you can throw away the script. I'll have clients sometimes send me 300 pages worth of strategy plans. I will read it. I'll speed read it. But then I'll also massively prepare how I'm going to run the day or a couple of days. But the more I've been doing this, the more I know that I'll probably throw it all away within 20 minutes, and then just see what flows.
Yeah. I mean, I'm almost incorrigibly at that end of the spectrum. Yes, like you, I read the briefing and I try to understand it, but I also know that, I've been introduced typically, with a few days to go. I'm never going to get up to speed on this to the extent that participants are. They're the experts in the content of this. I probably can't help them with the content, even if I wanted to. I won't be able to get up to speed to the extent that they are. And I kind of know that. I mean, there's two. I suppose the caveat I would say is, although I might not do so much planning in terms of written agendas and documents and processes, I do a lot of daydreaming, or for a stressful one, worrying. And I turn ideas over in my head, but I don't tend to write them down as a plan. And I know that in the run up to an event, if it is a challenging one, I'll be worrying about it up until about 12 or 24 hours before, and then all that worry sort of vanishes because I know it's showtime and I go into a different gear. And then when I'm in the room with the people, I generally feel much more comfortable because I go, right. So this is what I'm working with. These people, this sort of feeling of energy, this kind of engagement, this atmosphere in the room. That's what I feel like I like to work with. Yeah. And, I don't want to say, facilitators do trot out these cliches. I'm a bit conscious of, claiming this mysterious capacity to read the room. Well, I think we're all very fallible at that, and we might misread it. But I think we've got an attunement to it. We're at least attending to it. And I think because we're not quite so on the detail, it's easier for us to do that.
And ultimately, they're not bringing us in for the detail. We're not subject matter experts.
No.
It's funny. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about unhurried conversations, and I'm also recognizing I generally stay to around 30 minutes on this for the podcast listeners, but I think this still gives us time to be unhurried about it. One of the things that you touched on, and again, if I was nodding a lot on this video, then I would have been nodding a lot to this and agreeing, is this human piece of the feeling, which I think is societal conditioning sometimes, the feeling that we need to reply when we've got an answer, or as Covey would say, listening with the intent to reply as opposed to the intent to understand. And it was very interesting to me. You noted for 8 years you've been running these unhurried conversations, and you, in a way, it felt like you were referencing that as, in addition to the value it provides to the participants, it's also a learning and reminder and reinforcement tool for you for when you then do your facilitation gigs, to just keep working that muscle of when do I listen, or of listening and being fully present and not actually saying anything. So perhaps just tell the audience a little bit about the unhurried conversations, perhaps linking to what we're talking about, but just what are they all about?
So it's something I started, I think it might be 10 years ago now. I've slightly lost track, but when I first moved to Cambridge, I would go to networking events in the hope of networking with people, but I didn't like them because they all seemed rather sales oriented and a bit impatient. And you couldn't really talk about the challenges you were working on before someone would interrupt with, have you tried this? Have you met so-and-so? It all felt very hurried. And so I decided to create an antidote to one of these events. An hour later, I invited everyone to come to this as well, just so you can experience the difference. And I used this process, which I'd seen before and used occasionally before, about using a talking stick, which is an ancient process. Most of us have either been in it or at least seen it parodied in films in some form. And I had this meeting with a talking stick, and we quite liked it. So I started to do it. Well, I did another one, and it became a regular thing. And about the same time, I'd had a conversation with my friend Anthony Quinn about improv theatre, which we were both quite fond of. But we were confessing to each other that improv theatre is tremendous fun when it's good, and it's awful when it's awful. It's excruciating when it's clumsy and the actors trip over each other and the scenes become sort of absurd and the audience laughs, but it's awkward. And we were talking about what's the difference. And he said he thought the good improv was unhurried. That was the word he used. And I thought, oh, that's a good word. I thought I'm going to use that. in other things. I think that's a good quality to look for in all sorts of things to do with human beings. And so I thought, oh, well, I'll stick that on the front of these conversations and I'll call them unhurried conversations. They're basically conversations with a talking stick, which means that when you speak, you don't get interrupted. So you have very clear signaling when you're starting, when you're stopping, and people don't get to the punchline of your joke before you do. They don't correct your views. They don't interrupt you. And it creates this very different dynamic. And I've been running, I must have done 200 of them in the last 10 years, maybe more. And so they've just given me a lot of practice at not doing too much as the facilitator, and often being surprised at the interesting places a group takes things when there isn't even an agenda. Because normally I do them without an agenda other than talk about what's on your mind. And people might talk about quite different things, but you've actually, even when they do, you start to notice, well, there are resonances between people, and you can see why there's a connection of a sort between one thing and another. And it's been a really good reminder of how talented people actually are.
Mm-hmm.
And also, and this happens all the time, it's again and again and again, when people talk about what is on their mind, you realize, oh, so everyone is trying to make sense of a somewhat confusing, complex world. And sometimes they're stressed out by it, and sometimes they're amused by it. But everyone we pass on the street is trying to figure out, how do I get what I want today? How do I manage living in, the political conflict that we're in, the inflation that we're in, all these challenges and difficulties. And I think it's easy to assume that we're the only one thinking that, and that everyone else rushing about knows what they're doing. And it's a relief to go, oh, okay, so we have this in common, this desire to make sense of the world, and then there's the pleasure of sharing that inquiry with each other, without offering lots of advice.
When I came on it, I hadn't ever experienced anything like that, and I'm sitting here with a talking stick on my desk, which is a piece of cactus carcass from the beach in Mexico. Because I was introduced to it at the Modern Elder Academy in 2018 when I went across there. I actually met our mutual friend Kay through the fact that I said, anybody else in London who's to do with this? And they went, oh, there's this lady called Kay, who's also been on the podcast. Their discipline on it, they called it a circle. Their discipline on it was really disciplined, because you did it with the same group like 15 times over the course of a week, is no feedback. Yeah, no taking on the theme, just say whatever is on your mind. And so sometimes, I found it really amazing. What then did is the group I was in, which is 12 of us, we decided to continue it online on Zoom from 2018 every couple of weeks. And we had an hour, and we kept the discipline, and we just did it online, and we did some chit chat till we got on, and then when we started the circle, somebody would ring a chime or a gong, and then we're in the space, and everybody just shares whatever. And it was a little bit surprising that it kept going, but then people started to, we're all invited to a wedding in California, and 8 of us out of 12 of us went, and then a couple of the Americans moved to Switzerland or whatever. So it's like there was this need, there was an unspoken feeling of staying connected in different places and having consistency. Then, of course, the pandemic hit in March. And then to your point about making sense of the world, and, humans are meaning makers. It was just the simple shared experience that we'd already built up of listening to each other for about approaching 2 years. We'd begun to lose some impetus, and sometimes only 3 people out of 12 would show up on the calls, but we kept the consistency every 2 weeks without a break. So then, of course, as soon as the pandemic hit, how many people are we finding on the calls, would you think? Almost everybody, every time. And we weren't jumping in and saying, oh, that's what you're finding in San Francisco, or what we're finding in London is this. We're just listening, and everybody will have different stories. And I've found that the depth of understanding and relationship built with that group of people through just listening to what's going on, it's very powerful. And of course, over a period of years, the stories became deeper and deeper and deeper. And then they would start talking about, it's a very confidential space. They start talking about deep family issues or relationship issues that they probably don't talk to anybody else about other than this group. So so in addition to the power of, which I'd never really thought about, of being on something and not giving your opinion, right? Which can be very useful if part of your role is facilitation. It's also there's meaning to it. So my favorite book in the world is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. So I'm a big one for meaning. I don't do much small talk. So no, just thank you for just bringing that forward for me. But so you still run these or every so often, and people can follow you probably best on LinkedIn, I would think. You have your own website, don't you? But
yeah, you find me on LinkedIn. I post bits and pieces there. I've got my own website. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so it's So Johnnie Moore, spelled Johnnnie, Moore with an E, and people can find you on that. So it's been really interesting listening to your thoughts on this, and my big takeaway is knowing when to vanish into the background and when to assert yourself in the foreground. Just love the language and the visuals that stimulates for me, both because it's both energetically. Sometimes, I mean, I'm 6'3". We've never met. I don't know how tall you are, but at my size, it's can be really noticeable if you step forwards or step back.
Yeah.
So sometimes I'll almost hide behind the flip chart.
I can understand that. Yeah.
So what closing thoughts might you have for our audience, Johnny?
Oh, closing thoughts.
I'm
not sure I've got any now. No, I'm drawing a blank. I feel like we covered a lot of ground, actually. I don't know if I can add much more to it, to be honest.
Super. Then that's perfect. We are, as to use a cliche from the Modern Elder Academy, we are complete.
Yes. Or was there that line in Hamlet, which I was always very fond of as an adolescent schoolboy? The rest is silence.
Well, one of these days we should do a silent podcast like Steve Chapman's done.
That would be
another good podcast guest. 100 episodes of silence he did, didn't he? So anyway, okay. Many thanks, Johnny.
Thanks, Tom. Good to see you.